You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Malfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
Welcome, Monsignor.
Thank you, Teresa.
We're in show number 34.
Okay.
And we are still in the Civil War, and
Heat of battle.
We were finishing up the Battle of Pea Ridge.
Yeah.
I think we're going to begin to talk about that a little bit and what happened with that today.
That's right. We're starting off with the Confederate retreat back out of Pea Ridge. And then along with that, of course, is Father Bannon.
Yes.
And as he's joining the route, he's attending to the wounds of one of the Confederate generals. This is General William Slack. And at the same time also takes the opportunity to baptize a dying soldier. That night, after the defeat, he spent the night out in the woods. He had to be contemplating the horrors of that day. That's the first battle he had seen in a big way.
It was gruesome.
And it was gruesome. It really was. The Confederates lost between 800 and 1,000 killed, wounded, or captured. That was basically what was left then of the Trans-Mississippi Army. Was taken to Van Buren, and then from there taken all the way across to the east side of the Mississippi River.
Wow.
Yeah, and that army would never see Arkansas or Missouri again. It spent the rest of the war on the east side of the Mississippi River. The Union also lost around 1,000 dead, wounded, and missing, but the difference is that they held the field. Mm-hmm. And so on that battle, March 7th and 8th, they could then claim that they had saved Missouri. Sterling Price would come back again with an army, and in fact at one point would make his way so close to St. Louis. I believe he was around Maplewood.
Really?
Yeah, but it was never a real serious threat.
Okay.
But we'll talk about that later on. One of the veterans of Pea Ridge reflected on the role of Father Bannon and the role that he had played in those 2 days of battle. This is Colonel R.S. Musser, and this is in 1885. There was a reunion of the veterans of Pea Ridge, the Confederate veterans of Pea Ridge, and Father Bannon was not there.
Okay.
He was in exile back in Ireland, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. He could not come back to this country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is what Colonel Musser said about Father Bannon. I ought not to forget to mention the gallant and meritorious conduct of Father Bannon. He had the general care of souls throughout the whole army. He was everywhere in the midst of battle, when the fire was the heaviest and the bullets the thickest. He was armed with a tourniquet and a bottle of whiskey. Wherever there were wounded or dying men, Father Bannon was at his side, supporting his head. With his tourniquet, he staunched the blood flow, and with the spirits, he sustained his strength till his confession would be told, or if necessary, till he could be baptized from waters of the nearest brook. Father Bannon was an Irishman of splendid physique, full of grace and personal manliness, learned and eloquent, social and genial. Wasn't that a beautiful tribute?
That is a beautiful tribute.
Yeah.
One that I'm sure that he would really have welcomed.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, there was another veteran who also said something similar. These are actually two historians that had talked about Father Bannon, and they said this. He said, his influence in a religious sense was felt by all who associated with him, and his presence wherever he went repressed the rude manners of the camp. Not that he objected to gaiety and mirthful pleasure, for he had a most affable manners and genial nature, but he always frowned upon the soldiers' unrestrained expressions and rude jests. He was physically large, handsome, dignified, refined, and cultured. While his mission was one of peace, he became noted for his bravery in the field, in attending the wounded, and dying in various exposed places. He was both a pious and practical man, and became a ministering angel wherever broken and bruised humanity needed help and consolation. Lovely tributes. Yeah.
Wonderful things to have said about you.
Neither Ziegel nor Bannon would find rest in the rest of 1862. In April, the priest would find himself on yet another battlefield. This is the Battle of Iuka and the Battle of Corinth in Tennessee. And in August, the German general would be participating in the Second Battle of Manassas. Later on, we'll take a look at both of those. The year itself, 1862, also marked in the East what was called the Peninsular Campaign. And usually people who study the Civil War spend their time on the East Coast, and all the big battles are going on there. We've been looking at what's going on here in the Midwest, but in the Mid-South area. But over in the East, there's a big contest taking place. The Union Army is under the control of General George McClellan. This is the Army of the Potomac. Interestingly, the armies of the Union are named after rivers, and the armies of the Confederacy are named after territory.
Okay.
So, for instance, you'd have the Army of the Mississippi, which is a Union army, but then you also have the Army of Mississippi, which is a Confederate army. Okay, and in this case, what you've got is the Army of the Potomac, a river, is the Union Army, and opposing it is the Army of Northern Virginia, which is the Confederate Army. It's under the leadership of Robert E. Lee.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. And what happens is that the Union Army moved very, very slow up this peninsula between the York and the James River. And the idea was to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. Now, why on earth McCulloch didn't use those rivers and send up gunboats, I don't know. But he was extremely cautious about the whole thing. And Lee gathered together an army of 70,000 men. So, I mean, you know, there are a couple zeros behind those numbers that aren't out of the West.
There's where you learn those zeros are pretty important.
That's right, yeah. And the idea was to drive McClellan and his army back down the peninsula, which he succeeded in doing. And eventually, then McClellan took his troops and moved them to Washington, D.C., to the safety behind some of the fortifications there. With that, President Abraham Lincoln fired Little Mac, and he replaced him by General John Pope. Meanwhile, out in the West, other things are happening. You've got a general who's just come back and is going to make a name for himself, Ulysses S. Grant. And he takes an army down to Cairo, Illinois, and captures Cairo, and then from there begins moving up the Tennessee River against two Confederate forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, which fell 1 month before Pea Ridge. And 1 month after Pea Ridge, Grant scores another victory. This is the bloody but decisive defeat at Shiloh on the Tennessee River. The Confederates call that the Battle of Pittsburgh's Landing, and named after the landing itself on the river. The Union names it after Shiloh because there's a Shiloh church in that battlefield there. This opened up the South, which is the reason why Van Dorn's men left Arkansas and were sent over to the other side in order to try to close up the upper South that Grant had now opened up. So the Missourians will never see Missouri again throughout the war. Now, Father Bannon was going to join, and did join, ultimately, the Trans-Mississippi Confederate Army. But before he goes over to the east side, he spends some time in Arkansas in the company of fellow Irishmen. This is something for us to keep in mind, that when Arkansas was created as a diocese out of the southern portion of what had been the Archdiocese of St. Louis, right, what they did was they sent the first bishop to Arkansas, and this was Bishop Andrew Byrne. He was an Irishman from County Meath. And Bishop Byrne succeeds where St. Louis bishops had failed in order to plant in the Catholic Church in Arkansas, and he does it with Irishmen. So he's going to recruit Irish priests and also Irish nuns to come to Arkansas. And the Catholic Church that we have today in Arkansas really finds its roots there, not in the efforts of Peter Richard Kenrick or Bishop Rosati.
But from Bishop Andrew Byrne.
Andrew Byrne, yeah. Well, one of those priests that Father Bannon is going to come in contact with is Father Patrick Riley. Remember that the Battle of Pea Ridge takes place in early March. Mm-hmm. This is March 17th, and Riley and Bannon get together, and they celebrate St. Patrick's Day together. And then after that, he moved down the Arkansas River along with Wade's and Gibor's artillery units, and celebrates Mass with both of those units. Okay. At Little Rock, Father Bannon then visits the convent of the Sisters of Mercy, and they all came over from Ireland too. I think that convent is still there. I think that school is still there.
I don't know.
I know 20 years ago it was.
Okay.
Because when I was teaching at Christian Brothers University in Memphis, we had girls from Little Rock who were graduates of the school there. They knew the Sisters of Mercy. Actually, we knew some of the same sisters.
Okay.
Because I went to Mercy High School in St. Louis, and some of those sisters had been transferred to Little Rock. So
all I can say is that growing up in Arkansas, I knew that if you went to Catholic high school, you had to go to Little Rock. So
yeah, I think you're right. That would have been it.
There weren't any other Catholic high schools at that time.
Well, once again, Father Bannon was able to celebrate Mass for these sisters, both on April 4th and on April 5th. While he's there, he also comes in contact again with the residue of battle, because the sisters have now taken their school and converted it into a hospital, and they've got 25 Confederate soldiers there that they're nursing back to health. You know, the Sisters of Mercy were founded to run schools for poor children back in Ireland, but they soon found themselves engaged in hospital work, which they are very much so involved today. And there's an interesting history behind that, too, because what happens is that during the Crimean War, which was 1854 to 1856, there were Irish units. Remember, Ireland was at that time, was part of the British Empire. Yes. And there were units from Ireland that were part of the British Army that invaded the Crimean. And 2 Mercy sisters were asked to come along to act as nurses. And so what happens is that's exactly what they do, and they learn to care for the wounded. And so what happens is that these 2 sisters ended up, if you follow their career, they ended up in America, in the United States, and they were sent to Cincinnati. And rather than go to Cincinnati as teachers, they went as nurses in a Cincinnati hospital. And so the Sisters of Mercy taught each other the skills of nursing and ended up then serving in both the Union Army and the Confederate Army as professional nurses. Father Bannon points out that the only professional nurses in either of those armies were Catholic nuns.
Wow.
Yeah. And we're going to see a little bit later on, there's a doctor from St. Louis who is pressed into service. He's actually an ophthalmologist, but he ends up becoming a surgeon in the battles for Donelson and Henry. And he himself, he's going to be on a steamboat, and they're going to turn the steamboat into a hospital, and he's going to go out of his way to try to recruit Mercy Sisters and Sisters of Charity for him. He doesn't want these lay people around because they don't know what they're doing. He's Jewish. And it's a wonderful story. Dr. Pollack is a wonderful story. We'll say a little bit later on. I just tease you there. It just goes to show you, how all of this history's got to interweave.
That's what I was just thinking, the webs that are woven, and now we have the Mercy Health System.
Yeah.
Through the sisters.
Yeah, and it all starts out with 2 sisters.
2 nuns.
Who were sent over to the Crimean Peninsula.
War.
Yeah, remember the charge of the Light Brigade?
Yes.
Yeah. And that from there came all of the work that the Sisters of Mercy do in the hospital work.
They need to make that more known. We need to get these shows on the air better.
I know, yeah.
That's fantastic.
That's,
okay.
Yeah, that's part of the fun of doing this whole program.
It really is.
You make all these little discoveries. Yeah.
The great things that have been accomplished by Catholics throughout our history.
Yeah. And the neat thing here in St. Louis is that you're standing right around and you look right over and you go, oh, there's Mercy Hospital. Oh, there's the whole Mercy system. Oh.
That's beautiful. God is good to us.
Well, as I say, Father Bannon came in contact with the residue of this terrible human carnage that had
Right.
happened, At Pea Ridge, there are hundreds of men that had died on both sides. The Union counted about 980 wounded, and the Confederacy suffered about the same. Along with that, about 300 Confederates were captured in the battle, and so they're going to spend the rest of the war, basically, unless they're paroled off, they're going to spend the rest of the war in some terrible prisons, some of which are here in St. Louis, and we'll talk a little bit about Archbishop Kenrick's attempt to try to help them as much as possible. Later on, we'll talk about that. These casualties are minor in comparison to what happened at Shiloh, and then certainly Henry and Donelson. The Battle of Shiloh or Pittsburgh's Landing is believed to be the most bloody battle in American history. The historian Shelby Foote added up all the casualties of all the American wars until that moment. So he took all the casualties of the War for American Independence, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, added them all up, and there were 23,273 American casualties in these wars. Then he turned around and he combined together casualties from the North and the South. At the Battle of Shiloh alone, there were 23,741 dead and wounded. In other words, in that one battle, more Americans died than all of the wars that we had fought until that day.
That is unbelievable.
Oh, yeah. To read over the events of that battle is shocking. The number of men that fell. There's one spot at that battlefield is known as the Hornet's Nest because the bullets were flying as thick as hornets. How you can live through that. Well, added to that, St. Louis got an early taste of having to deal with large numbers of wounded soldiers. As early as the Battle of Wilson's Creek, nearly 1,000 casualties were transported from the field to the railhead at Rolla, and it was done on rough wagons. There was no suspension. So you think in terms of the Battle of Wilson's Creek going back to August of 1861, and remember as Sigel and the rest of the Army is retreating from Springfield back to Rolla, all those men who were casualties and the wounded have to be transported on those wagons. When they get to Rolla, they're then put on trains and brought to St. Louis. But those trains weren't exactly comfortable either at the time. When they got to St. Louis, whoa, what do you do now? So you have St. Louis Hospital, known as Malamphy Hospital, run by the Sisters of Charity. That was instantly filled. There wasn't a bed available, as well as the city's municipal hospital. That was filled. There was an organization that was put together. It was called the Ladies Union Aid Society, and these were all amateurs. It was an attempt, at least, to do something.
To give care.
Yeah, to give care. And they were overwhelmed. And then when the Union abandoned Springfield, it brought another 500 wounded up to St. Louis. The founder of Washington University, this is William Greenleaf Eliot, is looking around thinking to himself, we've got to do something a little bit more professional than this. And he got together with another set of men. One of those was James Yateman, who was a banker, and Carlos Greenlee, who was a grocer, and then George Partridge and Dr. John B. Johnston. And they went to the overall commander in the West, and this is General John Fremont. And they wanted to establish what they referred to as the Western Sanitary Commission. And this would oversee the care for the Union wounded in a more professional way. And very quickly, the commission was then systematized the beds at the two hospitals, St. Louis Hospital, the Catholic Hospital, the Municipal Hospital, and then also there was another hospital called the City Quarantine Hospital, and that was taken over. And then they built another hospital in the north part of the city called Benton Barracks, and that was going to be another military hospital. But the reality is that still, the manpower being provided was basically women volunteers doing all of this, and they were learning on the job. It was pretty darn sad. One of the volunteers, a woman by the name of Sarah Hill, said this: "We were called on to assist the surgeons in their operations and to nurse their patients. There were no regular nurses then, and volunteer nurses were scarce." And as I mentioned, Father Faraday points out in his book that the only professional nurses at the time were the Catholic nuns. And so you were darn lucky if you had a sister of mercy or a sister of charity to be able to take care of you. There are all kinds of stories about these volunteers coming in and assisting. And, the biggest operation back in those days was amputation.
Right.
These nurses helping out and all of a sudden flipping out and just, falling over.
Oh, I can imagine.
Oh, yeah. I think I probably would too. I'm sure I would.
I guarantee you I would have run.
Well, on the Confederate side, it's believed that there were some 600 nursing sisters for the Confederacy, and they were fully appreciated. And they had multiple requests for nurses from the Sisters of Charity's hospital in New Orleans. In the North, the sister nurses, on the other hand, were met with an incredible amount of prejudice from such quarters as none other than Dorothea Dix, the director of the Federal Nurse Program. She didn't want any nuns in her program. Because she's anti-Catholic.
Kidding me.
No, she's anti-Catholic. And, the Confederate government paid the expenses of the nursing sisters. The federal government only bent when circumstances demanded it. You look at the expenditures. It's a pretty sad sight. It's the exact opposite of what we would expect, when we think about this stuff.
Right.
There's one example of this federal reluctance to employ Catholic sisters, and it's found in the story of Dr. Simon Pollock, who I mentioned before. He was a native of Bohemia. He had studied at the University of Prague and at Vienna, traveled with medical commissions to cholera areas in Russia. He is a respected physician. When he came to America, he came mainly in order to get away from anti-Semitism, which was typical of Central Europe. He started out in New York, then moved to New Orleans, and eventually came to St. Louis. In St. Louis, Dr. Pollock really found his home. He had made friendships with other physicians, Dr. McFeeters and Gratz Moses. And as time went on, these two doctors became distant from him because of the Camp Jackson affair. Both of these doctors had seen what had happened, and they developed Southern sympathies. Dr. Pollock never did. He becomes the first doctor in St. Louis to specialize in ophthalmology, making St. Louis a leader in the education for the blind, which it still is today. He helped open the Missouri School for the Blind. He introduced Braille as a teaching tool. He invented all kinds of tools in order to study the diseases of the eye. He finds himself in heated discussions with Doctors McFeeter and Moses, who left St. Louis and joined the Confederacy. He himself left St. Louis, also moved to New York for a while, but eventually he'd be drawn back in. And he's drawn back in by the United States Sanitary Commission. So he was supposed to lead this unit that I had mentioned before, along with Ulysses S. Grant in the attack on Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee River. And he serves on the steamboat. It's outfitted as a floating hospital. He's being aided by the Ladies Union Aid Society, which he does not appreciate, with the exception of two women. He found the ladies to be absolutely useless. He refers to them as society imps. And that's when he got himself into trouble with the Western Sanitary Commission and its founder, William Greenleaf Eliot, because Dr. Pollock, who knew the Sisters of Charity very well, because while he was in St. Louis, he became a victim of cholera. And he was at the hospital being treated by the sisters. And he survived, obviously, survived the cholera epidemic, but he had the highest regard for the sisters. And so when he ended up on that steamship, the Continental, that's when he wanted the sisters to assist him. And Eliot, again, doesn't want the sisters involved in this stuff. And so there's this big argument. So you have this Jewish ophthalmologist tried to get these Catholic sisters to work with him, and eventually he succeeds in doing that. And he's being opposed by Eliot, who is a Unitarian minister, but is also in charge of the Western Sanitary Commission. So it's just all kinds of bizarre stuff.
That is bizarre.
Yeah. So next time when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the fight between Eliot and Pollock over the sisters and continue on with our romp through the Civil War.
It's almost like a joke, a Unitarian and a Jew.
Yeah, and a Catholic nun.
Yeah. All right. Well, so we close with prayer, your blessing.
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Monsignor.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.